Welcome back to another episode of Litigious, the number one podcast on the internet for discussion of legal issues in the news. I'm Scott Peterson. Giovanna's here with me today, as always. Just a reminder, this podcast brought to you by DeRazio Peterson, a plaintiff's employment and serious injury litigation firm in New York, Massachusetts, and Vermont. So if you have questions, visit us at DeRazioPeterson.com. If you have questions about the podcast, feel free to reach out via socials, Instagram being probably the best at Litigious Podcast. If you enjoy the show, like, follow, subscribe, and share with a friend. So on to this week's stories. We have there's a few interesting cases in the news this week. Starting out with something that we've been talking a lot about, probably as long as we've been talking on this podcast, which is the consequences of your actions in the private world as they relate to your employment. And this one arises out of the Dodgers Milwaukee Brewers American League divisional series, where a fan got herself into some trouble. Do you want to explain what happened here?
Well, it sounds like there was a guy who was a Dodgers fan, right? And he was sort of heckling some of the other fans. And he kind of got into it with this woman who, did not take our advice, which is be aware of the fact that you're being recorded at all times. And so you need to watch what you say. And he, I guess was visibly sort of a Latin American kind of origin. So she yells at him that they should call ICE on him. Turns out this guy is an American citizen. He's a veteran. And this all blew up. I think the man himself was also behaving poorly. And my understanding is that once this all shook out, they have both been banned from this stadium. But her ICE comments, because obviously that's something that's pretty controversial right now and in the news on a daily basis, is she seems to have borne some more significant consequences than he did because of this, because she was fired from her job. They had to issue a statement about her comments, and I guess she was on the board of Make-A-Wish, and she had to resign from the board. So this is just,
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a classic example of like what you said, which is you have to assume that you're being watched all the time. And so apparently she also made fun of his drink of choice. I guess maybe he was drinking like a White Claw or something, and she told him real men drink beer, and then called him the P word.
yeah.
So I think all this stuff got caught on video, and it's just, her employer was probably like, all right, this, we're not gonna deal with this. But to get to the comments of, that we always talk about, it's, you don't have protection in a private workplace for saying those kind of things and being caught on camera. So there's really nothing that she can do about it, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and I think it's just continues to be sort of, I mean, we don't want to necessarily beat a dead horse because we talk about this a lot, but you can be fired from your job for pretty much any reason as long as it's not discriminatory or in retaliation for doing something that the law protects, which is very limited. And yeah, I mean, and it's tough because in this day and age, there are people recording all the time, and there are people who try to bait you as well. Now, there's no excuse necessarily for coming out with we're going to call ICE just because the person looks Latin American. So, you can say, hey, well, you're responsible for the consequences of what you do. But I think I feel like we ourselves were in a situation once when we were coming out of a concert at Madison Square Garden where a car full of young women started, this was right before the election, started, yelling at us out of the car with their phones out, asking us like who we were voting for and who do we like. And it's like disconcert, and they want you to react in a way that they can post something on social media or make some content about it, and it's a weird time to be alive where you have to worry about that. But to me, it's like if somebody's got their phone out, you might as well keep your mouth shut.
Yeah, but it kind of points to like a bigger concern of, it's increasingly becoming that basically every interaction can be recorded. So, I'm not saying that this woman should have said the things she said, but we're really treading into waters of you really have to just watch what you say at all times because everybody can potentially always be watching. I just saw an interview with Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle, who, if people know, is also buying TikTok US. His son just is his running Paramount. They're basically going to be controlling multiple branches of media and social media over the ensuing years. And he had a comment about how he wants us to live in a society where everything is being recorded all the time because he thinks that it will encourage people to act more properly. Uh, to me, that's like dystopian and very concerning because it doesn't allow anyone to ever make a mistake. And this is kind of an example of it, but this is a grown person who, said something not only stupid, but, probably, racist and, got herself into trouble. So I'm not saying in this case it's wrong, but I do worry a little bit about every interaction that everyone has being recorded because all of us have said or done dumb things in our lives. So.
Yeah, and I think, and actually in this situation, the man who got into it with her, who again was not, behaving himself either necessarily, said he didn't think she should have gotten fired from her job. So, I mean, I think that in people's day-to-day life, they understand that you can say something stupid. I mean, look, I do think that there is a spectrum of like doing something rude. I mean, we talk about this, just relating this back to the law. Say, for example, under Title VII, that's the discrimination statute under the federal law. There's a lot of case law out there that being rude and being disrespectful in the workplace is not illegal, and that the law and Title VII and anti-discrimination laws are not intended to be some sort of civility code in the workplace. So there is a difference between rude and disrespectful behavior and then behavior that crosses a line and becomes either racist or sexual harassment, or something like that. And in this situation, her comment crossed the line into a racist comment that now your employer has to deal with, because we do live in this world where people find you and dox you and get in touch with your employer when you cross the line. And then they are in a difficult position of, how do I deal with this? Is this something that I can just say, this is, we know and we're dealing with it and whatever? Or do you have to take the next step and say, well, now I have to fire this person because they exercise bad judgment and they've reflected poorly on us, and there's no excuse for this particular comment that they made. Because look, I mean, you can certainly cross the line. I mean, we saw this recently with the young Republicans, I don't know, club is not the right word, but like young Republican committees got blown up because of their text messages, and that crossed the line. Like, there's no excuse to make, and no legitimate reason ever, even in a joking form, to make jokes about rape or for white people to use the N-word. Like, then you cross the line and now you're in sort of a different context.
Yeah, and actually, we could have led with that story because it's very similar to this one, where people said something that ultimately got them fired. Because I'm pretty sure all these guys got fired from, or many of them got fired from their positions. I just read that that young Republican organization, I think, disbanded.
Yeah,
And
I think the
so
one in New York did.
yeah, so and JD Vance came out and said, he talked about that this was you know, basically kids being kids and saying something stupid, and he doesn't think something stupid should get you canceled for the rest of your life. Um, I I disagree with him on this particular set of facts because I think most of what was said, from what I can tell, crossed over the line. I understand what he's saying, although that I don't think that that's applied necessarily evenly, in terms of the outrage, and that sort of applies on both sides of the aisle to some degree, because there's sort of like selective outrage about these kinds of statements a lot of the time, and you know, um, people might call for one person to be fired in one situation and then not in another, depending upon where they fall politically, which I don't think is really the right analysis. It's more like, did they say something that their employer thinks to themselves, this reflects negatively on us as a company? That's really, I think, the litmus test from an employment perspective. Otherwise,
Yeah, and
I
I
don't know.
think that the political committee that had their group chat sort of blown up. I mean, they were not kids, they were adults. So I think you and I, having being parents of teenagers, understand that kids can say and do stupid things sometimes. I would like to think that we, are hopefully teaching our kids that there are certain things that you just don't go there. Like that's not, that's certain things that are not a joke and never a joke. But that being said, can you wrap your mind around, somebody making mistakes as a kid? Yes. When you're, an adult in their 30s, I don't think you're kids anymore. And I think that's just a way to sort of try to brush, something under the rug. Um, I don't like, I think as someone who represents people in especially sexual harassment cases, that sort of like boys will be boys, locker room kind of excuses is not something that I personally like to hear, because those are used often as ways to minimize and ignore workplace conduct that actually is very harmful to people. Because, if you're a woman and you're going to work and people are making sexist comments to you or overly sexual comments to you, and then, after the fact, they're like, oh, that's just locker room talk, that's giving really no credence to the fact that, when you're going to work and trying to do your job, that's not just talk, that's interfering with your ability to do, your work. And so I don't like that whole like framing, I think is problematic in general. And then like you said, it's not applied evenly because we just, we belabored this already in a couple other episodes, but we have had controversial things come up recently, the death of Charlie Kirk and everything, where, people were being called out and told that they should get fired and have their lives ruined for how they reacted to that. So it's a little bit hard to kind of keep your credibility when you're applying your standards of what's appropriate to say and do, pretty unevenly.
I think from a more practical level, I think that it's easy to, for anyone really, to take positions about whether or not this is okay when you're not the person who is running the company that this person works for. You don't have to deal with the fallout from potential customers or shareholders or stakeholders. So it's a very different perspective. When you're coming at it from, you know, uh, sort of like a broader or political or unattached perspective, it's easy to say, well, this is just innocent, boys will be boys. That, which is, if you feel that way, fine. But if you were running the company and your bottom line was potentially being hurt, or you had to deal with customers pushing back on you because you employ somebody who is saying this kind of stuff publicly or in a somewhat public forum, then you would feel much differently, because your perspective would be different. So I don't know. I take all that. I take all that with a grain of salt.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what we talk about too in the employment context with people maybe being fired for something that they do, or even, with this political committee, some of it is not that you're necessarily being fired for what you did or said, it's your judgment.
Yeah.
Like you should have the judgment, in my opinion, to realize that something that you might say at a party with like-minded people maybe doesn't belong in writing in a quasi-professional context, or, like, I don't know. I mean, that I think is something that is sometimes the more relevant, is just what somebody's judgment is in the moment. Like, we don't expect everyone to be politically correct at every second of the day, but most people would probably exercise a certain amount of good judgment about, how do I behave in public? What do I, think is appropriate to put in a text message? Like, what do I think, so I think that's part of it from an employment perspective, and we've run into that in our practice where, people come to us, and employers, and they're like, my employee put this on social media or whatever. And, sometimes it really is just like looking at something and saying, wait, like, why are you saying this right now? Why are you doing this?
Yeah, it's another example of social media being a real problem. And this seems so innocent now. Um, Maybe like 10 or 15 years ago, when I was a younger lawyer, I used to give speeches on or presentations on occasion to high school kids, and just talk about like the legal practice in the profession. And I would routinely talk to them about posting stuff on social media, which was relatively new at the time. And I was like, and this is before marijuana was legal, but this was always my example. I was like, look, I don't think anyone really cares if you decide that you want to, smoke pot or, try something in your free time. Nobody's going to really judge you for that necessarily as you get older. Um, but what they're going to judge you for is your decision to put a picture of yourself smoking a bong or smoking a joint on your social media page, because that shows bad judgment. I think that's still the case. We talk to we have kids in middle school and high school, and this is like a huge topic now, because kids post stuff on social media of themselves doing things that we all did as kids. But it's like, you got to have better judgment than that, because the wrong person sees it and you have a big problem. So all right, we don't need to belabor that anymore. So we'll move on to, this is a sad story. I remember when this happened, and it was like several years ago. A baseball player for the Los Angeles Angels, Tyler Skaggs, OD'd on fentanyl and died. And he was a young player. And it came out after the fact that he had been supplied with opioids by an employee of the Angels. And at this point now, the family his wife and his mother have sued the guy who provided the opioids, as well as the Los Angeles Angels, under the theory that they knew that their staff were supplying these types of drugs to players, and they let it happen, and they supplied him with the drugs that ultimately killed him. And this hit the news this week because the trial is going on right now. And Mike Trout, who, if you don't follow baseball, is one of the greatest baseball players probably to ever play the game, certainly currently playing, but he plays for the Los Angeles Angels, and they're terrible. And because they're on the West Coast, they don't get much coverage in the East Coast. So a lot of people don't know how good he is, but he testified because he was very good friends with Tyler Skaggs. The family is suing for $118 million in lost earnings, which might seem like a lot, but actually for a baseball player, that's probably pretty accurate. As well as pain and suffering and punitive damages against the team. Their claim is that the former communications director who provided and supplied him with the fentanyl knew about, or was, that the team knew about the fact that he was supplying it. He, the former communications director, is serving a 22-year prison sentence after being convicted of supplying Skaggs with the fentanyl that killed him. So interestingly, Mike Trout, in his testimony, he testified for 3 hours, and this is the part that was the most important, was the question came as to whether Trout, knew that clubhouse attendees who worked for the team were supplying players with drugs, and his response was maybe. So why don't you explain why that might be important?
Yeah, so this is kind of goes back to something that we've talked about a bunch of times on prior podcasts, which is situations that implicate both criminal and civil liability. So, like you said, the supplier is in jail, and now the family is figuring out who else is accountable for this. So, in any kind of negligence or wrongful death situation, just as the legal background, you have to show that the person you're suing had a duty to you to act in an appropriate manner, and then that whatever they did wrong caused the harm. So in these types of situations, both of those things can be sometimes difficult to demonstrate because the law doesn't always recognize a situation where it's someone else's job to protect you or prevent something bad from happening to you that is being done by sort of a third party or done by yourself in a situation where we see this in drug overdose cases and then also in cases that involve suicide. It can be sort of legally tricky to put the liability for something that is caused by maybe multiple different factors onto a company like an employer or a hospital or a doctor, or in this case, a sports team. So I think what's relevant about the testimony that you mentioned is that one of the questions in a lot of those types of cases is what did an employer or a school or a hospital or something like that, what did they know about what their employees were doing, such that you can demonstrate not only did they have a duty to you because of their relationship with you, but also that they did something wrong. So yeah, I think like this is definitely a sad case. I mean, I think you see the opioid overdose cases more in the medical malpractice context. But I think in a sports team you would blur the lines there because they have their own doctors and their own people that are sort of involved in giving some type of medical care to their team.
Yeah, you see this thing a lot. I mean, this reminds me of the Tom Petty situation where someone was maybe giving him something that, they knew could harm him, Michael Jackson. And
Matthew
more,
Perry from
yeah,
Friends. I think his
yeah. Well,
doctor is in jail
I
as
was
well.
gonna,
Oh,
yeah, I was
sorry.
gonna say more recently, Matthew Perry. Um, I'm calling this now. I think the Angels are going to get hit on this. I think that it's probably Trout's testimony is probably the tip of the iceberg, and they said they have multiple other witnesses. I think that it's going to come out that they knew that this was happening and they turned a blind eye to it. And yeah, there's a defense argument that this guy was a grown up and he made his own decisions to take this, and that's a legitimate argument. But I don't think, and I could be wrong, obviously. I don't think a jury is going to let the Angels completely skate on this. That's my feeling.
Yeah.
Um,
And just from a little bit of a legal background in terms of how the process works, if this case has made it to trial, that I would assume that that means that the issues of duty and what we call proximate cause, which is what actually caused the harm to the extent that you can blame, it on someone else, have already probably come before the court because those are kind of threshold issues where you would say, okay, either number one, I don't have a duty to this person to begin with, then you don't even get any farther. Or you can say, okay, I did have a duty to this person because, based on my how like a sports team works, I do have a duty to my players to protect them in some way. But then the next question is, what actually caused this to happen? And there are definitely arguments that can be made in certain circumstances where you can say, we were not the cause of this. Like we see this in labor law cases where a construction worker is injured on the job and they say, it's this contractor's fault because they didn't give me, I had a case like this in my old firm, they didn't give me an appropriate ladder or something to use. And then the employer or the contractor comes and says, well, no, you actually took this ladder apart and did something completely dangerous with it, and you were really the only cause of your injury. Um, so, that is an argument that can be made before you ever get to a trial. And in a situation like this, and I think from the articles that I read about this, this is the position that they're taking, the defendant, which is that this man was the own cause of, his overdose through his own decisions. And what they would argue is that was the only cause, because you can have multiple causes of an accident and hold people liable for it. But if something else is the only cause, then theoretically the team would get off. But
Yep.
at least in New York, in the malpractice context, where doctors have overprescribed opioids to somebody who maybe has like drug seeking behavior or who they know has a drug problem already, the cases say that it is foreseeable that this person could have a drug overdose, whether it's because they, even in a situation where they may go out and procure even more drugs illegally, because that's another part of the sort of negligence and duty analysis is the outcome a foreseeable result of your negligence or your action. So in those situations, it's foreseeable that giving drugs to a drug addict or overprescribing opioids to somebody who might be exhibiting like a drug seeking behavior, it's foreseeable that that person could have an overdose. And that kind of lends itself to this argument that you not only did you owe this person a duty, but that you are also responsible for what happened.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Um, well, I think, again, I could be wrong. I'm not sure there's a huge love for the Angels organization in LA anyway. So if it
I mean,
was
I
if it
would
was the
take that
Dodgers, maybe it
maybe.
might be different.
Yeah, and I mean the testimony is certainly not going to help them because that maybe is a yeah. I mean, that's a yes.
That's a yes. Yeah,
That's a
100%.
yes. It's not a no.
It's not enough. Um, well, all right, we'll jump ahead because I was going to do this last, but speaking of the intersection between criminal and civil activities, Mark Sanchez, former New York Jets quarterback, uh, and current commentator for Fox NFL, is in hot water and still recovering, by the way, um, because or following an incident that happened on October 4th when apparently a drunken Sanchez, who news reports said was doing wind sprints in the streets before this happened. So God only knows what was going on. Um, anyway, he got into a fight over a parking spot with a 69-year-old man, uh, who then stabbed him in the stomach. And Sanchez, I think he's still recovering. Um, long story short, he's being criminally charged with, I believe, assault and battery, and has already been sued by the 69-year-old man whom he assaulted uh, in a civil case. So this did not take long to kind of rear its head. His criminal case is moving forward in December. Civil cases take longer, but there is an interesting intersection between criminal prosecution in a case like this and its implications on a subsequent civil case. In other words, somebody gets charged with um, assault in a criminal case, and then they get sued for assault or various other torts in a civil case. Why don't you talk about what the potential implications are of the criminal case on the civil case?
Well, since the standard is higher in criminal cases beyond a reasonable doubt, if you are convicted in a criminal case, that can be used against you in a civil case. It doesn't work the other way around because the standard is lower in the civil case, which is why we sometimes see people, the civil justice system sort of stepping in where maybe somebody was acquitted in the criminal context, like O.J. Simpson being the most famous example of that. But yeah, so I mean, if a criminal and I would say the criminal cases sometimes can move a little bit more quickly.
They
Um,
have to.
yeah,
Yeah.
in the sense of being able to use that against you. But yeah, so this was just a self-defense, I guess, right? I thought it was a DoorDash driver. Did I make that up?
I don't think it was a DoorDash driver. I don't know. The guy was backing into a big parking spot, I guess. Um, to your point, though, so in our practice, here's how this plays out. Somebody gets hit by a car. The person driving the car was intoxicated. Our client who got hit is severely injured. There's tickets issued and charges made against the person who was driving the car. In those cases, we will typically be proactive about trying to work with the district attorney's office, or at a minimum following the course of the criminal proceeding, because we don't want necessarily some kind of a plea that would not admit to the allegations. So, if somebody admits that they were intoxicated and caused an accident, that makes our case much easier to prove against that person in a civil proceeding. Versus if they take a plea to some kind of like non-moving violation that doesn't admit necessarily fault, so then you actually you still have to go ahead and prove your case. So it makes the civil case potentially significantly easier to prove. And normally, we don't typically go after individuals. Mark Sanchez is presumably a guy with a lot of money. They're also suing Fox Sports or Fox NFL.
Why would they
That
do?
seems like, well, I think they're going to. So where this happened, they were traveling for the Fox broadcast the following morning. He was supposed to call a football game the next day. So I think they're probably arguing that he was acting within the scope of his employment when he was doing this. I'm assuming Fox is going to take a much different position and say this had nothing to do with his employment. But the question is, was he acting within the scope of his Fox employment by virtue of the fact that he would not have been there but for his Fox employment? And did Fox maybe have some notice or indication, kind of going to your last point, that he was an angry drunk, or he was having alcohol or drug issues? I don't know. I think it's a stretch. I can see why they would add Fox in as a defendant, but I think that's
Yeah.
probably a harder
Yeah, I
argument.
think that's a stretch too. But I was going to mention that also, like you said, I mean, I think you obviously see celebrities and rich people getting sued all the time. That is relatively rare as compared to the majority of people who are going around assaulting people are just sort of private, non-celebrity, non-rich people. And typically there's not much positive that could come of suing one of those people because you're never going to be able to collect on a judgment against them typically if they don't have any money. But yeah, then in certain circumstances, and this kind of goes back to the Tyler Skaggs story as well, that you can find a company with sort of deeper pockets who is also partially responsible for what happened. And a lot of times I would say in assault cases, you see that come up when people have been overserved at a bar. And, in New York, it's called the dram shop law, where you can sue an establishment that knowingly overserves someone who's drunk, and they leave and they either beat somebody up or they get in a car accident. So there's definitely situations where, I've looked into this before from more of a employment slash negligence kind of context. When you talk about holiday parties, that's something that we periodically visit, where when can employer be liable for bad behavior after a holiday party? So when you're looking at Mark Sanchez's employer, I mean, maybe, if you're at a company event and you get wasted and they overserve you and then unleash you out into the world and you do something inappropriate, could there be situations where you might be able to go back and sue somebody who hosted an event or something? Maybe.
Yeah. And you're always looking for in that situation. I mean, this goes back to the Skaggs case against the Angels. They want a deep pocket, and if they think legitimately that the deep pocket had some bear some responsibility, they're going to go after them because again, going after an individual in that case is probably not worthwhile, especially when it's someone who's serving time in prison in that case. All right, one more story we'll talk about before we wrap. Back on the golf topic, Jack Nicklaus, arguably, well, before Tiger Woods, the greatest golfer of all time, was awarded $50 million in a defamation lawsuit against his former business partners. And this happened in Florida. So the backstory here is, if you don't know who Jack Nicklaus is, well, you should. But he was a golfer in the 60s and 70s and 80s. I think he won his last Masters in 1985 or 6. But had a company, originally had a company called, his nickname was the Golden Bear. He had a company built after that, built a very successful business, merchandise, clothing, etc. He merged that company several years ago with another business and formed the Nicklaus Co's with a billionaire banker. He then exited that company and took a buyout, which had a non-compete agreement for maybe like 5 or 6 years. As that non-compete was coming to a head, or excuse me, about to expire, he was trying to use his name again, because that part of the non-compete, he couldn't use his name or I guess any of the logos. And he alleged that the two men who were then running the company created a smear campaign against him, and in the context of claiming that he was basically not mentally equipped to run his businesses. I think he's 85 years old, and that he was also working on a deal and negotiating a deal for $750 million to join the Live Golf League, which, for those who don't know, is a separate golf league that started several years ago, run by the Saudis, and brought several high-profile U.S. golfers over, paid them a bunch of money, including Phil Mickelson, Bryson DeChambeau. Long and the short of it is they've taken a lot of criticism. A lot of people in the sports world think that this is a way for the Saudis to basically whitewash some of their problems and get some credibility on the world stage. Long and the short of it is that never happened. The deal never happened. But Nicklaus filed a defamation lawsuit against the company and against the two essentially owners of the company, claiming that they defamed him. A jury, and this is where it gets interesting, the jury awarded him $50 million in the defamation case against the company, but found in favor of the two individuals on the defamation claims. So basically found that the company defamed him, but the individuals were not specifically responsible. Primarily, the claims arose out of a lawsuit that these guys filed against Nicklaus in New York. That's where these allegations were. So there's actually like a number of kind of interesting legal issues that make it somewhat surprising that this actually resulted in an award for him.
Yeah, I noticed that as well. So this case was in Florida, so I don't know if they're applying the defamation law of the state of Florida. We talked about this, I think, in the Blake Lively case, how you can have a lot of complicated issues about whose state's law to apply, depending on where the allegedly false statements were made. I mean, typically in New York, you have a litigation privilege where you would not be sued for defamation for allegations that you make in the context of a legal proceeding. Otherwise, people would be sued for defamation every single time they file a lawsuit, because there's always somebody on the other side of the lawsuit who doesn't agree with anything that you had to say in your lawsuit. So typically that kind of stuff is protected by, and in New York, it's an absolute privilege. Like, you can't even get around it. So that might not be true in Florida. It is also possible that this didn't make it into the article, that these are statements that were then repeated outside of the lawsuit that's when you start to get in problems. Like we talked about that in another episode about Jay-Z, where he was allowed to proceed with a defamation lawsuit against an attorney, because that attorney started to make some comments on social media that sort of went outside of the lawsuit context. Another thing I thought was kind of interesting in this case was that it's a little funny when people are sort of saying something bad about you, but on the flip side being like, everything is great, nothing harmed you. So that was
Yeah.
another argument that the defendants in this case were making. So in a defamation case, there's a couple different types of defamation. So, and it impacts what the person who was defamed has to prove. So typically the kind of definition of defamation is a false statement that harms your reputation. So you have to typically demonstrate that not only was the statement false, but that it harmed you in some way. So in New York, we have what's called defamation per se, which means that usually it's being accused of committing a crime. So if you've been accused of committing a crime, the law assumes that your reputation has been harmed by that. So we see that come up in cases where people are accused of sexual assault or things like that. I think we also talked about this in a prior episode where somebody called someone a pedophile. There's questions sometimes, is this an opinion? When you accuse someone of something, of somebody kind of outlandish, is there a way that you can frame that as, oh, this is just an opinion? Or have you, which is not protected, or have you actually accused them of a real crime, which would be defamation per se, and that person would not then have to prove that you actually tangibly harmed their reputation. But if you have just sort of said something false about somebody, like he, is too old to manage his affairs or something like that, that's not accusing someone of a crime. Typically, you would have to demonstrate that their false statements have harmed you in a tangible way, usually in a financial way. So one of their defenses was that he suffered no harm to his reputation because of these comments. He's doing great. He hasn't lost any money. He hasn't been able to show that he suffered in any way because of this. But ultimately, this was a jury verdict, so they didn't buy that.
Yeah, a big jury verdict. And I read that, and that was the first thing I thought is, well, not first thing, but it was interesting because as someone who, look, I don't follow. I mean, I play golf. I like to watch, big golf events. I don't follow day-to-day golf very closely, but as far as I know, I don't think Jack Nicklaus's reputation is bad. I mean, I think he's a very well-loved person in the golf community. So, but that also might be the reason why he got that big verdict. People might, I think the case was in Palm Beach County where
Yeah, well,
he
I was
lives.
wondering that too. I was like,
Yeah. I mean,
he had a good venue for that. I'm sure he's
yeah,
like,
they love him down there.
in there. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So it was a Palm Beach County jury, and he's lived in North Palm Beach for like 50 years. So they probably it's this local beloved hero, and he's suing these out of town billionaire bankers. Yeah, you can totally see how this would happen.
Yeah, who like don't want you to use your own name,
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
and
So
whatever. So, and I don't think they care too much about the live, whatever it's called.
no,
I
and
don't
the
know
other
that
piece of
people
it,
are offended by that. I mean, I think people do make sometimes a big stink about that stuff. I know that comedy, well, was that in Saudi Arabia too?
yes, the comedy festival. Yeah,
I mean, people, will get upset about this stuff, but depending on what your circle is, I don't know that people cared about too much about that.
I don't think people care that much. So, yeah, that's a whole nother topic. But um, Yeah. So anyway,
His Palm Beach jury did not care about that.
no, they don't care about that. And they probably figure that $50 million to a billionaire is really nothing anyway. So, or a company that is run by a billionaire. Okay. We're kind of running out of time here. Anything else today?
No?
All right. Okay. Well, we will be back again soon. Thank you for listening. Again, if you enjoy the podcast, please like, subscribe, and follow, share with a friend. And thanks as always for listening. We'll be back again. Talk to you soon.